My name's Andrew. I'm here with Workers' World Party. Also have a little bit to do with Youth in War and Racism, but also Baltimore Asian Resistance and Solidarity. We are holding this event today because this month is Asian Pacific Heritage Month, Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, or APAM. And I think one of the biggest reasons I wanted to get this event happening today is that there's not a huge amount of discussion about sort of the U.S. Asian diaspora among the revolutionary left. I think it plays a pretty prominent role in some more sort of academic focused and liberal institutions, and there's a lot of ways that the problems of the U.S. Asian diaspora get presented and reduced in a way that doesn't build a movement. It doesn't actually address sort of systematic racism. It doesn't sort of address some of the more core issues. So I wanted to get that conversation started today, and I specifically wanted to get that conversation started from a socialist perspective. There's a lot of different political tendencies among the U.S. Asian diaspora, and the socialist perspective is kind of a marginalized one. And I think that if more people hear from a socialist perspective and from a Marxist perspective, then maybe we can sort of like push people into a movement that actually addresses racism, heteropatriarchy, and smashing white supremacy at its very core. I think some of the stuff that I want to talk about is what do they talk about in sort of academic Asian American circles, and it comes out of sort of these Asian American studies programs. It comes out of ethnic studies programs. It also kind of comes out of critical race theory, which, if people haven't heard about it, is actually, when people first stumble upon it, and I know I'm speaking from firsthand experience, it sounds like this very radical thing, where it sort of talks about racial hierarchies and actually sort of like tries to trace in law specifically how racism exhibits and how to fight it. But then you figure out that all this isn't confined to courts of law, and it's confined to bourgeois courts of law specifically, which we know is not a justice system, and is rather sort of a way to enforce white supremacy and this racial hierarchy that we're talking about. So then in these circles, we talk a lot about the problems of representation, whether it's media, whether it's politics. A lot of the problems being framed as there are not enough Asian Americans in elected political positions, right? There's not enough Asian Americans in TV shows that we watch. And, of course, these actually are issues and are actually reflective of a white supremacist system, but when they're framed as the main problems, something about that framing says, if we just fix those things, then it's going to be better. And from the socialist perspective, we know that not to be true. And so then there's also one of the main problems that are presented in Asian Americanist programs is the problems of the model minority myth. Do people know what the model minority myth is? Can I get a show of hands, just because I think it'd be important to sort of just really briefly touch on it. It is this idea that Asian Americans in the U.S. Are a shining example of an oppressed nationality who came to the U.S. with little to nothing, but really picked themselves up by the bootstraps and were able to make something of themselves. And so other oppressed nationalities, whether it's the black people, whether it's Latinx people, whether it's indigenous people, they should be looking up to the Asian American diaspora and saying, this is what we need to do. We know that this actually is a problem. We know that this really does drive a wedge between oppressed nationalities, but we have not exactly examined the sort of root source of what this model minority myth is. And I'd like to talk about it a little bit because it's something that doesn't get touched upon in some histories. I actually think there are fairly good historians of the Asian diaspora in the U.S. Who really do look at different labor struggles, who really do look at sort of the narratives of resistance that the Asian diaspora, puts up against white supremacy, against wage exploitation. But there's such an insistence in these circles upon an intersectional analysis that is taking into account all the different kinds of special oppressions that people face. Capitalist oppression, racist oppression, gender oppression, sexuality oppression. But what they forego constantly is a class analysis. And that's not to say I'm advocating for a class-only analysis. They just need to lump it in with everything else, right? So, I mean, these historians do a really good job about looking at sort of early migration, some of the root causes of early migration, such as, hey, your nations are exploited, your nations are oppressed, come to the U.S., you'll make so much more money, and you'll be able to support your family. You'll just have to work here for a little bit of time, and you'll be able to go back because you'll have so much money, it'll last you a while. And that was sort of the message that, what were they called? Drummers, especially in the Philippines, and that's my mother's from the Philippines. That's sort of my area of expertise. But that's what they would tell people in the Philippines to come to the U.S. They would come to the places like Hawaii. They'd come to places like California and the West Coast, but also in the East Coast. There's significant early migration history here in Baltimore. But then they would quickly find out everything that they were told was a lie, right? They'd be working for very little money and facing sometimes much worse working conditions, and realized quickly that something had to be done. Something had to be done about resisting the sort of wage exploitation that they were facing. Historians have some interesting stuff about sort of the multinational coalitions, especially in the sugar plantations in Hawaii, wherein they had to band together despite difficulties of language barriers and of different cultural norms, to ensure that they were being paid, to make better working conditions, and fight back against the wage exploitation that they were facing in the sugar plantations. And then, come on in. And so, outside of the specific union struggles or labor-based struggles, the historians, I think that's kind of where the historians stopped short of a class analysis, right? And I kind of wanted to talk about sort of the change in stereotypes of sort of Asian migrants, wherein very early on they're viewed as these very poor, the stereotypes were that they're gamblers, the stereotypes were that they were, heathenish and completely alien to United States culture. And it was because they had a class base, right? There's a specific class of sort of Asian migrants moving to the U.S. very early on. And these were people who were peasants under feudalist systems. These are people who were workers under capitalist systems. And there's actually a specific point where this started to change, where these stereotypes started to shift to something different, and where it sort of switched to the model minority myth, right? I would point to the 1968 Immigration Act, And if people don't know what this it came sort of at the end, not the end, sort of mid-Cold War, where it was then, afterwards, it was much, much easier to migrate to the U.S. from Asian countries specifically, but a bunch of others as well, if you already had some sort of high degree of education, if you owned a business, or if you already had, some amount of land or inheritance or whatever it is. And there's a specific change to the class character of people migrating to the U.S., right? They also made it very easy for refugees of sort of war-torn countries to move there as well. So people who were hostile to sort of revolutions happening in Asian countries, and people who had viewed themselves as in particular danger in these war-torn countries. So, and that's where I'd argue sort of that there's a change to the class character of people moving to the U.S. And that's where the stereotype started to shift to where it was, instead of the Asian worker, instead of the Asian factory worker, farm worker, whatever it was then the Asian business owner, right? And not that these didn't exist beforehand, right? Because sort of Asian migrants were pushed into these sort of middle economies where they had to, have their own, I would almost say autonomous economies outside of sort of white businesses, where they had to own their own businesses, employ each other, and sort of provide that kind of community for, and I think they were called ethnic enclaves. So those existed, but then this stereotype becomes even more prevalent. And I think that's just sort of the root of the model minority thing today. And, people have not mentioned this in any sort of Asian American, and maybe they have, but I've missed it. And so that's sort of what I wanted to bring up as sort of in contradiction to what is the mainstream Asian Americanist narrative today. I just wanted to close with why I, here in the U.S. Asian diaspora, sort of advocate for a socialist lens or socialist position, and specifically a Marxist-Leninist position. Because Marxism-Leninism, specifically, one of its core tenets is an insistence on an anti-imperialist stance. And this is, I mean, even before I knew that I was interested in socialism, even before I knew I was interested in Marxism-Leninism, I had learned a lot about this history of the Philippines. And that drove me to an anti-imperialist stance. So before I was a Marxist, I was an anti-imperialist. If people don't know, right when the Philippines was fighting a war for its independence from Spanish colonialism, it was about to win. The people of the Philippines were about to win and establish their own constitution, their own self-governance, their own self-determination. But then guess who swoops in? Is the U.S., who made a deal with the Spanish, and sort of the Spanish handed it off, and the U.S. sort of says, okay, I see what you're doing, but I'm not going to let you do it. We need the Philippines as, resources to exploit, but also as a foothold into mainland Asia and its economy. And in doing so, sort of committed a small genocide in the Philippines, killing over 200,000 men, women, and children. And I think those numbers, I think that's a conservative estimate on the number of people that died. So I think sort of when we reduce the sort of problems of the U.S. Asian diaspora to representation and to the model minority myth and things like that, I think we miss that actually our relationship is tied sort of to a history of imperialism and to a history of capitalism, and a history of anti-communism. Sort of that's the reason a lot of these wars were in Asian nations. So that's all I'm going to do, and I'm going to introduce the next speaker. Thank you.
It's something we don't talk about, so thank you for having me.